They didn't eat for pleasure, they ate to survive. These meals were born in hard times, held together with flour, water, and sheer determination. Your grandparents relied on them when there was nothing else. And for the next 2 hours, we're serving every last one. Boiled onion dinners are essentially exactly what they sound like. The idea here was to take an entire onion, use some salt and pepper, and, well, just get to it. This isn't really something that I think could apply at all today to our world or lifestyle anymore, but if you feel differently or better yet, have different experiences surrounding this, please mention them in the comments. I'm so curious about what this even feels like afterward. This is very telling of the kind of lifestyles people were having before the Depression ended. It was something that was really common in early American frontier households, especially the ones from the 18th and 19th centuries. Onions back then used to be equivalent to treasure because of how well they were stored, and they also were seen as a wonderful flavoring ingredient. Then, in Appalachia and different parts of the South, onions were such a common crop that they became a regular at dinners. It became standard practice to boil whole onions and have them together with some cornbread, of course. Any meat would help, but it was rarely given. Interestingly enough, from what I've read, the onion is supposed to get sweeter. But that's also a little strange because you just don't associate onions with that kind of flavor, right? During long campaigns, soldiers often had to rely on more than just their rations to stay fed. When the opportunity arose, hunting for fresh meat became not just a necessity, but a small victory in the midst of the hardships. Rabbits, deer, and wild boar were common targets. These animals were perfect for feeding a small group and could be cooked over a fire with minimal preparation. Roasting game was a simple process. After a successful hunt, soldiers would often skin and gut the animal, then roast it directly over an open flame or on a spit. The smell of cooking meat could be both a comfort and a temptation, scenting the air as a reminder that fresh food was not always a guarantee. While hunting provided nourishment, it wasn't without its challenges. A missed shot or a wounded animal could turn an evening meal into a frustrating effort. Hunting also brought a sense of normalcy during chaotic times. It was one of the few moments when soldiers could experience a taste of home, enjoying freshly prepared food, even if only for a brief moment. When meat was available, it was considered a prized delicacy, especially if the alternative was the more unappetizing, less exciting preserved food. Whether roasted over an open flame or eaten raw, fresh game was a rare but cherished reward in the soldier's diet. Lettuce past its prime wasn't something to throw away, it was something to transform. Wilted lettuce salad was a clever way to make the most of garden greens that had started to droop, and it turned an almost wasted ingredient into a dish with real flavor. This wasn't a crisp, refreshing salad, it was something entirely different. Instead of tossing out wilted lettuce, families salvaged it by dressing it up with a warm, tangy bacon grease dressing. The hot grease, often mixed with vinegar, sugar, and a pinch of salt, would slightly cook the lettuce, giving it a soft, savory bite. Sometimes onions or hard-boiled eggs were added if they were available. The practice of making wilted salads wasn't new. It had deep roots in Southern and Appalachian kitchens, where nothing went to waste. During tough times, people had to be resourceful, and using every bit of homegrown produce was essential. Lettuce might have been too delicate to last long without refrigeration, but with a little ingenuity, even the droopiest leaves had a second life. Wilted lettuce salad was a reminder of the era's mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. It was about stretching ingredients, finding comfort in simplicity, and proving that even tired lettuce could still have its moment on the table. Bread scramble is pretty much one of those moments of sheer creativity, resourcefulness, and making the most out of things that just would never go together if you were adhering to common sense. It's a throw-together breakfast if I've ever seen one. I mean, you would honestly be hard-pressed to not call this survivalist cooking. It's exactly what you might think it is too. Torn up pieces of bread that's either a day old at best or several at worst tossed up into a hot skillet. Add some butter and bacon grease, then scramble it up to high heaven with some eggs. People would typically add whatever scraps they could to make the meal stand out a bit more. They'd add leftover ham, onions, and different kinds of herbs, and flavor-wise, just think of it like a bread-based omelet. It actually soaks up a lot of the eggs and fat, so it's definitely a lot more flavorful than you would expect, and it gets the job done well enough from what is essentially a very impromptu breakfast. Probably end up with a nasty case of heartburn if you use this recipe regularly, though. Mock fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat, and a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. For soldiers on the march, portability was everything, and few foods were as reliable as bread and cheese. Roman legionnaires famously carried flat loaves of bread and wedges of hard cheese, often made from sheep or goat's milk. The combination was a nutritional powerhouse, carbs for energy and protein for strength, all in a package that could survive the harsh conditions of a campaign. But let's not romanticize it. The bread was often dense and tough, more akin to a brick than a baguette. Soldiers sometimes had to soak it in water or wine just to make it chewable. The cheese wasn't the creamy delight you'd find at a deli. Aged for durability, it leaned more toward rock hard than velvety soft. Still, when paired together, they made a meal that was surprisingly satisfying and, most importantly, long-lasting. In medieval times, knights and foot soldiers kept the tradition alive, carrying wheels of cheese and hearty loaves during long marches. Back then, breaking bread wasn't just a saying, it was a literal act of survival. Sure, it wasn't gourmet, but when the choice is between stale bread and hunger, even a Roman would tell you, the bread wins every time. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Oatmeal water porridge is something that sounds like it's ripped right out of a Depression-era cookbook, but that's only because it really is. It was supposed to be this zero-wastage dish that would inspire people to make the most out of the least, but it didn't really go past poor farming communities and immigrant-dense areas. What it was good for was digestion, though, because this was insanely light on the stomach while also being really filling. So the parents that did know about this would make it obsessively for their children, and back then, kids were a lot more cool about putting up with oatmeal. It was also perfect sick person food. Plus, even if none of that applied to a person back then, they'd still probably be living paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes oatmeal helps when it's not payday yet. The point being that everyone had a run-in with this at some point, but only a select few communities made a thing out of it regularly. Oatmeal water porridge is just oats simmered in plain water too, so it makes sense why it didn't go too far in the broader world. You don't have milk, sugar, or any extras here, and it was pretty much the definition of what you would call frugal. It was used in times when dairy was really unavailable and money just wasn't there, and texture-wise, it's a lot thinner than you can imagine. All that to say, it's likely not the most appealing bite. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. So we're going to start our list with bone marrow, which is honestly the most classic example of something going from peasant food to actually being a high-end delicacy fit for royalty. See, for most of our known history, marrow was just the byproduct of a good day at the butcher's shop. It wasn't special, it wasn't rare, and it definitely wasn't hard to catch or exotic. These were usually the things that would get you a good reputation, enough of one to end up on some bigwig's table, but bone marrow got the opposite end of the spectrum. And since butcher shops enjoyed the better part of a century as the top dogs, bone marrow was pretty abundant. Then you had all these people living in shanty towns and rural tribes and whatnot constantly swearing by it, and it really just created this warped view on the whole thing in urban areas. In the 19th and 20th century America, it was so common to see bone marrow stew everywhere you went, especially throughout the wars and the Depression. A few people towards the end of the 20th century helped flip the script, and one such name was Fergus Henderson, who helped bring bone marrow back to the scene with his roasted bone marrow recipe. American chefs who were fond of nose-to-tail cooking like Anthony Bourdain also helped popularize bone marrow dishes that were fit for any table. All that exclusiveness and attention obviously created demand, which obviously created price hikes, which obviously created more hype. And that's pretty much how we ended where we are. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Collard greens have been a peasant food for many reasons and for a long time. They were really popular in African American culture for sharecroppers, small farmsteads, rural villages, and more. A lot of people relied on them for centuries, but their reputation was always that of low-class food. Towards the 20th century, collard greens began to gain some respect as a symbol of the South and its humble, rustic cuisine. Now, what I like to think is that this dish was in the right place at the right time. See, towards the end of the 20th century, there was a massive health scare going around all of America, particularly the South. What can I say? Years of drippings, bacon, lard, fat, and deep frying things in oil or beer or both may do that to you. Collard greens began a light that people were flocking to, full moth style. People were familiar enough with them, had an acquired taste for them too, and liked all the different spins you could throw on the dish. So for a lot of people, they were the first step towards a healthier lifestyle. And that's really why they did a complete 180. Peanut butter noodles might seem like a blasphemy of several degrees when you first hear about it, but keep an open mind, an empty stomach, and very, very short patience, and you'll see where people are coming from. Peanut butter noodles were essentially the go-to for most people when they were really trying to stretch things out, and they wouldn't be out in grocery marts buying packets of egg noodles or spaghetti. They would be making it at home using wheat and flour or whatever substitutes they could find. It was actually a very admirable trait back then. People were really against buying anything that could be made at home. But just noodles don't really do the trick at all, does it? It doesn't help ease that hunger. I mean, it might fill you up, but there's also the psychological aspect of eating, right? You want to feel fulfilled after a meal, and when you don't, it's pretty natural for people to keep eating. When that wasn't an option, meals like this became godsends because they were simple ways of adding flavor, any kind of flavor to dishes that were otherwise so bland, boring, and dry on their own, but had to be eaten out of necessity, because what else were you going to do? Chicken bogs are some of the best things you can ever get in South Carolina. They're a classic in the Low Country, and it's one of the best one-pot dishes ever made in the country. This dish makes full use of chicken, rice, and sausage, and you know that any rice-chicken combination is a classic format for comfort food. This uses andouille, which is a type of smoked sausage that's known exclusively for its strong flavor. Then sometimes there are vegetables and chicken thighs in the broth. The big part of the names actually comes from the fact that it's a broth that is really heavy on the slow cooking. The rice also absorbs all of the broth, and this gives it an almost porridge-like texture and consistency, but an extremely rich flavor that you wouldn't find anywhere else. You can find this in North Carolina and Georgia too, and it's one of the most effective meals for big families. That state has always had a high population and a culture of big families, so it makes sense that dishes like these got popular there. Another thing that's really popular is the Hemingway Chicken Bog Festival, which actually does get held every year in Hemingway in South Carolina. As you can probably guess, the theme is exclusively chicken bogs. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. So a peanut butter molasses sandwich is pretty much as good as it gets. It's old-school lunchbox energy, and it's sticky, sweet, and salty. It's pretty much made to power you through the day on a mostly low-key budget, and it's also exactly what it sounds like. This is a very hearty smear of peanut butter, and it's usually something that's layered with a drizzle of molasses on plain sandwich bread. Molasses tend to add this really deep, smoky sweetness that's a lot more intense than any kind of honey or jelly, and the peanut butter essentially rings the salt and fat. This makes it really well balanced and filling, and the sandwich shows up a lot more during times when economic crises were your average Tuesday. I'm talking about periods like the Depression and the middle part of the 1940s, where even an egg was not really promised to you. This was especially true for people in working-class homes. Peanut butter was something that people loved because it was really heavy in protein and dense, and it would work more often than not with molasses. The boldness and earthy sweetness of molasses actually bounced off really well with the richness of the peanut butter, and it's not a light sandwich at all. Some of the best things in life came from improv, and hobo stew is pretty much the exact same. Hobo stew is pretty much a dish that was made out of sheer necessity. It doesn't have a set-in-stone recipe or any strict guidelines to follow. With this recipe, all you really need to do is essentially just take whatever vegetables and meat scraps you have, or just whatever you have in your pantry, and keep it in one pot. This essentially stews, and the end result is usually a complete wild card. Not only is this a good way to make use of everything in your house, ensuring nothing goes to waste, but it's also a pretty handy way of checking out your cooking skills. A lot of the reason dishes like these were even good in the first place is because people had an intuitive understanding of what flavors would work, how much of something to add, how long to let something stay on the stove, and that's just something you develop from trial and error, so get to experimenting instead of ordering. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. Seaweed. Would you ever really like seaweed? I think that they're considered edible only in cartoons, but honestly, I was wrong. Seaweed actually used to be a survival food for a lot of coastal communities, and it has been transformed as this affordable everyday food to something that's completely the opposite. In America, seaweed was typically used either by coastal communities as a food they would eat when they would have nothing else, or a fertilizer. Sometimes people would use it for animal feed and as a thickening agent, but that was really just in the Depression. It was definitely something that was exclusively considered poor man's food, though. People had begun to make such strong associations between seaweed and famine diets that the image was really hard to shake off. It wasn't until after the Second World War had ended that sushi culture and Japanese cuisine in general started to really get popular in America and gain some steam. This is where nori, a seaweed dish that's pretty much a staple in the average Japanese diet, started to come in. This dish popularized how effective seaweed could be paired with the right ingredients and assembled the right way. Seaweed used to be something that was always considered a low-class meal for people who couldn't afford any better, but now it's considered a healthy food that has a lot of nutritional benefits and can be used for making some pretty cute dishes. Honestly, the fact that nobody is talking about how good molasses toast is these days is certifiably criminal behavior. I just want you to picture hot toast, and I mean real, genuine bread, not packaged, factory-made fluff, but actual freshly baked bread with deep, dark molasses. Not the generic stuff you find in marts and stores nowadays, but actual molasses. Blackstrap, bitter, smoky, sweet, and punchy. This is something brown sugar wishes it could be. Molasses toast is something that was definitely the moment back when it was popular, and those were times when you would consider sugar a luxury. Most folks tried to get it on everything they possibly could, whether that was biscuits, cornbread, hot milk, pies, or toast. The first person to put that stuff on toast hit a gold mine, and everybody copied the blueprint afterwards. The toast was absolutely the move, and butter melting with the molasses created this perfect harmony of sweetness. The bread was the perfect stage for that. And if you had it today, you'd feel like you're going back through time to a farmhouse kitchen in the 40s. You can eat this toast as it is or mix it up with some honey and nuts if you really feel like bringing out your inner chef. Some people also double down on the sugar rush by adding cinnamon and vanilla extract. Milk soup was exactly this kind of dish. People really just wanted anything sweet during the Depression, mostly because, unlike carbohydrates and protein, it would actually change their mood. Something that was considered relatively impossible during the Depression, hence the name. Milk soup is also exactly what it sounds like. This isn't some kind of fancy dish where you add a lot of sherry wine or lots of rich foraged aromatics and herbs to the milk to make some tonic. This is literally just milk and flour. If you're particularly lucky on the day you make it, you might even add some butter. This would thicken the soup too, and well, make it more soup-like. Still, this was something that people kind of just gulped down because they had nothing else. I don't think it would particularly work well today for us because it's so hard to get anyone today to drink milk regularly unless it's in a frappe. So imagine serving milk soup. It's just not something that does a lot for you, you know? Still, assuming you have nothing else and absolutely no options left to try either, then it might make for an okay filler snack. What do you think? Is milk soup something you'd give an honest shot to? Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? A hot meal didn't always mean something fresh from the stove. Sometimes it was as simple as a bowl, a handful of crackers, and some milk. Cracker and milk soup was one of the humblest dishes of the Depression era, basic, filling, and made with ingredients that lasted. Saltine crackers were cheap, widely available, and often handed out at relief centers. Families kept them on hand because they didn't spoil quickly, making them a reliable pantry staple. When bread was too expensive or hard to come by, crackers became the substitute. Some people crumbled them into a bowl and poured cold milk over them. Others warmed the milk first to make it feel more like a proper soup. If sugar was available, a sprinkle might be added for sweetness. If times were harder, water replaced the milk, turning it into an even more stripped-down version. This wasn't gourmet dining. It was about getting something in your stomach when options were limited. But for those who grew up eating it, cracker and milk soup was a reminder of the sacrifices families made, the resilience they showed, and the meals that carried them through. In the toughest of times, even something as simple as crackers and milk could feel like comfort. Lobster was something that was so abundant in New England during colonial America times that they would honestly just wash up on the shore. And I'm not really talking about a few lobsters, a little nice gang of them. I'm talking about a massive lobster pile. I mean, most people were tired of the damn thing. They had no idea how to spice it up or what else to do with it. That's how common lobster used to be. They were abundant, they were cheap, not special at all, and just the exact most extreme opposite you can imagine from where they are today. Hell, farmers used crushed lobster shells for fertilizer. That is the state we are talking about today. It also never got a chance to make a big, bright name for itself because lobster was always geographically locked to the coastal cities, so people who lived far away just didn't have it. That is until canning came around. Now, canning made lobster a lot more accessible, to the point it became a shelf stable. And then came railroads in the 1800s that meant that people were able to trade lobster with inland cities like New York. And of course, the rich saw a new toy, and this was one they could dress up all pretty and everything too. Chitlins have a longer history than you might think. They were originally a survival food for poor people, right? Especially in the American South. Now, it's exactly those roots that tied it so strongly to its community. People had been relying on this for years, and they had honestly come to be too familiar with it, especially in African American communities. In West Africa even, you have lots of dishes that involve offal meat. But chitlins weren't out of their initial image just yet. They were still considered a poor man's food, and in truth, that is what they were. Even in the late 1800s, it was really just sharecroppers and southern farmers that had these. It wasn't until the early 20th century that chitlins had become rooted the way I was talking about. They were still largely popular in just the South, but it was things like the chitlin circuit where legends like Aretha Franklin and B.B. King's were known to perform and help turn them into a common food. I mean, the circuit was known for having chitlins on hand all the time. Despite that, they still were considered a low-class food mostly because of the way it would take hours to cook and clean it to remove the smell. That part really put a lot of people off of it. Recently, though, in the 2000s, a lot of soul food restaurants have tried to reinvent it and have started offering chitlins served in really premium ways, doubling down on the cultural attachment while bringing culinary finesse. What about Sally Lunn bread? Have you ever heard of that? I bet it's a little new to you. Otherwise, I'll feel bad for not knowing. This dish was something that we got from our English immigrants that first began to settle down here, and it involves this yeast-leavened bread. It's such a popular item in the States, and it's one of the lightest breads you can ever have. Now, English records talk about an actual Sally Lunn who made this, but recent attempts at trying to verify this always seem to come up short. Basically, nobody knows if there was a legitimate Sally who made the bread, but it's legendary all the same. Its reputation is just as ancient too, since this can be tracked all the way back to the 18th century when the English colonial settlers first came over. It was later popularized again by immigrants, but the very first records of the bread come from this time period. It's sometimes comparable to brioche, but people also think of it as a breakfast bread or something similar to bread pudding. It got widely popular in all kinds of southern homes as the ideal way to start your morning, and it took next to nothing to bake. All you needed was your typical ratios of butter, sugar, and milk in the dough, and you were pretty much good to go. By the way, it goes great with some tea. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly-sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Kentucky's Burgoo Fest in Owensboro is actually one of the best things to do in the whole state. The Burgoo Festival is one of the most renowned festivals across the country, and Owensboro itself is known as the burgoo capital of the world, too. The actual history of the burgoo comes from the 19th century African-American communities that first made this into a southern dish. A lot of them were working in plantations and had to really play clever with their ingredients, and this meant that burgoo was something people couldn't live without. That only got worse when the Civil War rolled around and people started incorporating the recipe into the mainstream due to its ability to feed massive groups of people. The burgoo itself is this really thick and dense stew that has mashed potatoes, chicken, and all kinds of vegetables. You know those little quirks that each state has? The kind of thing that it becomes popular for, that everyone starts recognizing it for? That's basically what this was. There was a time when a sandwich didn't mean deli meats or fancy spreads. It meant whatever you had on hand, sometimes just 2 slices of bread and a few desperate ingredients. That's how onion and ketchup sandwiches became a meal. During the Great Depression, fresh vegetables were scarce, but onions were cheap and stored well. Ketchup, often considered a condiment today, was one of the few affordable ways to add a little flavor to otherwise bland meals. Put them together between slices of bread, and it became a poor man's sandwich, sweet, tangy, and just sharp enough to remind you it wasn't quite a meal, but it would do. There was ingenuity behind this simple combination. Ketchup, made mostly of tomatoes and vinegar, gave a touch of acidity and sweetness, while onions provided a crunch and some much-needed bite. For many, this wasn't just a makeshift meal, it was a way to stretch ingredients when grocery money had run dry. Some families added salt and pepper for extra taste, while others toasted the bread to make it feel more substantial. For those who ate them, onion and ketchup sandwiches were a symbol of making do, of finding a way to put something between 2 slices of bread when times were at their hardest. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. Vinegar pie for breakfast is something that really just doesn't even sound like a real meal. It honestly sounds like some kind of prank, but no. This is a very real dish, and it actually works in more ways than one. For starters, this doesn't really taste the way you think it would. I know you're imagining some really bitter, acidic notes from the vinegar, but the initial flavor beats are sweet tart, and they give off a very custardy vibe. It's a bit like a lemon chess pie, but just made with your typical pantry staples instead this time. The vinegar is the star of the show, as it should be, and it cuts through almost every other flavor present in the pie, but not to the point where you would think all you can taste here is just vinegar. It's rich. It has this tangy brightness that actually is very stimulating for your taste buds, and if you pair it up with some hot coffee, then it works as well as Bruno Mars does with Anderson .Paak. Vinegar pie is something that strangely, despite being a pretty innovative and flavorful hit, is something that would be called a desperation pie because it's something that was made mostly by the women of the South and the Midwest living in rural populations. Bacon ends and boiled greens are some of the most iconic meals you can get from the Depression. This is actually something that holds up just as well today. It was something we got from Southern survival cooking, and it was a dish that came out of long-standing culinary traditions surrounding boiled greens, a lot of hunger pangs, an incredible amount of resourcefulness, and being good with chopping meat. Bacon ends were the fatty parts that would be left over from a big slab of bacon. People would try to really keep these preserved and stored because they were laden with fat instead of a lot of meat. See, you were not supposed to actually eat these on their own, but simmer them so that they started to give off all that fat. This was amazing for flavoring stews, soups, and big pots of vegetables that were not really going to turn any heads on their own. Boiled greens have always been a massive cultural staple of the South, from collards and turnip greens to dandelion, mustard greens, and artichokes. If you're looking for a way to add some cheap and easy flavor to your dish without breaking the bank on flavorings, this is a pretty good way. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings. So depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water. Straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope, they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, But when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. Among the meals that fueled armies across Northern Europe, few were as humble and essential as porridge. Whether made from oats, barley, or a mix of both, this hearty dish was a staple in the Scottish Highlands and across many Northern European forces. Easy to prepare, filling, and rich in nutrients, porridge was a soldier's reliable companion, especially in colder climates where extra calories were crucial for maintaining energy. Soldiers were often given a basic porridge made from oats and barley, both of which were cheap and durable. The simplicity of the dish didn't stop there. Flavoring was minimal, often just a sprinkle of salt. However, on rare occasions, dried fruits like raisins or berries might be thrown in for a touch of sweetness, a welcome surprise in an otherwise bland meal. But the real beauty of porridge was its versatility. Whether served thick and dense or thinner, it could be adapted to whatever was available. The grains were easy to store and transport, and the dish could be cooked over a fire without requiring much effort. When times were tough, oats and barley provided soldiers with the carbohydrates and fiber they needed to power through long, exhausting days on the march. Before butter became the reigning toast topper, our frugal forebears embraced something a bit more rustic like rendered animal fat smeared across toasted bread. Whether it was pork lard, beef tallow, or even goose fat, this golden spread was the original zero-waste culinary move. After frying up bacon or roasting meats, no one dared throw away the precious fat. Instead, they'd strain and save it, turning it into a savory, energy-packed breakfast boost. Some would sprinkle a pinch of salt, herbs, or if you were feeling fancy, even a touch of sugar to balance the richness. Back then, animal fat wasn't just a cooking byproduct. It was a prized resource, especially during lean times. For rural families and urban laborers alike, it provided essential calories to power through physically demanding days. But as refrigeration, vegetable oils, and dairy products became widespread, rendered fat slowly slid off the breakfast menu. Health trends also played a part. The low-fat craze of the late 20th century practically demonized it. So, despite the way we got this from Hungarian immigrants, the American version of goulash is actually a lot simpler than the traditional recipe. This one has beef and pork in it simmered with different kinds of vegetables and paprika. But American goulash was something that evolved so that it could suit the circumstances people were in back then. Immigrants from Eastern Europe were introducing the Hungarian version, but by the middle of the 20th century, if you asked somebody what goulash was, they'd just tell you it was browned ground beef with tomatoes, pasta, and simple seasonings. Once all of that's together and it's simmered, you get your goulash. People would eat it with leftover meat scraps, which really added a decent amount of flavor to the dish if you had enough. What they would do is stretch out their food and conserve ingredients like bacon grease, butter, and meat scraps for dishes like this, which actually looked like you spent a lot of time on a well-thought-out cooking session. Something that was really rare if we're looking at the kind of food the working class was eating during the 20th century. One of the next inventive things people came up with during really hard times was potato peel soup. This is about as bare bones as it sounds because it's really just seasoned water that's been made into a makeshift broth with potato peels in there. Despite this, let me tell you a little about why this is a pretty good dish. It's because it keeps you full for an incredible amount of time. Have you ever had oatmeal and felt incredibly full afterward? For like a surprisingly long amount of time? This is because oatmeal has a substantial amount of fiber in it, and potatoes are pretty much the same. Half their fiber content comes from the peel itself, actually. This is what makes potato peel soup such a good dish for when you don't really have any kind of money. It sustains you and really helps keep your appetite down, which is sad in retrospect because you have to be keeping your hunger down, but these days we have to do that pretty often. It helps to have dishes that are really good with fiber because they have this nice effect of you wanting less food, and thus you have more money at the end of the day. Hoppin John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? In the Americas, soldiers didn't always have the luxury of fancy meals or fresh produce. Instead, they often relied on cornmeal, a staple that could be boiled up into a simple, hearty mush. Known as cornmeal mush, this dish wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, but it did the job, filling soldiers' stomachs and providing much-needed energy. The process was straightforward. Cornmeal was boiled in water until it thickened into a creamy, porridge-like consistency. Though plain, it was easily adapted. Some soldiers would add a pinch of salt, while others might include a bit of sugar or molasses if available. And on occasion, if they were lucky enough, a splash of milk or butter would make it a bit more palatable. Cornmeal mush was cheap, durable, and easy to prepare in large quantities, making it a popular choice during long campaigns. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, it was commonly served to American soldiers. If there was one thing they could count on, it was that their mush would be there to keep them going. While it might not have been the most exciting meal in the world, cornmeal mush was dependable. When you're fighting for freedom, or just trying to make it through another day in camp, sometimes simple sustenance is all you need. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil. A dash of salt and you were good to go at basically no cost. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Boiled barley porridge is one of those breakfasts that just feels like a pat on the back from a mentor, a hug from your best friend, or a call from your grandparents asking you to come over and try some of that breakfast you always love. It's also something that's built to last you at least until the middle of the day. You make boiled barley porridge by simmering hulled or pearl barley into water and milk, and then you get a soft, creamy texture that almost melts in your mouth. Flavor-wise, though, it's pretty nutty and kind of similar to oatmeal. You get a chewer bite and a bit more earthiness out of this, but it soaks up almost any kind of syrup or liquid you throw at it, as well as spices. That's a big part of why this dish is as flavorful as it is. We're talking about some serious ancient history when we discuss its origins, though, like this is the kind of thing that goes way further back, to the times of the Romans and medieval peasants. In the United States, it's something that was popular first in rural areas and immigrant homes, but each country has its own history with barley. So, the best part about going to South Carolina is easily the Frogmore stew that you can find in the low-country parts of the state. Despite what the name implies, rest assured, there aren't any toads or frogs that will jump out from your bowl of stew. It's just a small little reference to Frogmore. This is a community that you can find in St. Helena Island, located in South Carolina. It's said that this is where the dish first came from, and it's a one-pot boil that's become pretty closely associated with Carolina cuisine. This seafood boil pretty much is made of all the basic ingredients you would imagine modern boils to use. You have your mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, shrimp, vegetables, and spices, and it really is one of those crowd-pleasing dishes I talked about earlier. It's nearly impossible to go wrong with this dish because it's got a lot of variety. If you're sitting with a group of people who aren't the biggest fans of shrimp, you can throw in some cod, some oysters, or crab. Whatever kind of seafood gets the current group going, it can work in Frogmore stew. Since this is entirely a boil, it's also pretty nutritious. This is part of why the dish got so popular, since people living on the Carolina coast would rely on one-pot boils like these, which made use of the catch of the day: eggless pancakes. So the first time you hear that, you just automatically think that there's no real reason why these should exist, because what's next? Brickless buildings? But really, eggless pancakes have been around for far longer than you would think. This is especially true for lean periods like the Great Depression or wartime rationing in the 1940s, and a lot of eggs back then were actually decently more expensive than people could afford, or they just weren't available because somebody who could afford them likely scooped most of them up. COVID-era bulk buying wasn't really an isolated event, I guess. Most recipes would essentially just rely on baking powder for the fluff and use some kind of oil or milk along with flour. Old school versions, and I mean proper vintage recipes, would even include mashed bananas, vinegar, and some applesauce. And that's some proper veganism if you ask me. Eggless pancakes have largely faded into the background now, but they were definitely one of the most affordable meals our grandparents grew up with back in the day. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Let's talk crackling cornbread. This is the cornbread that absolutely doesn't mess around. Like, this is the supersonic of cornbread. This is that rugged, crispy-edged cousin of your typical cornbread muffin, and it brings with it all the rustic charm that cornbread is always known for. Crackling cornbread has always come from the innovative kitchens of the working class, and this is especially true in the South, where using anything less than all of the hog was considered culinary blasphemy. Wasting fat? You may as well hang up your butcher knife. It was about no waste, and cracklins were a prime example of why that mentality worked. These were gold, and stirring them into cornbread only made them shine brighter. It made the bread a lot more filling and gave it extra protein, and you needed that because if you were coming back from a day of shoveling mud, then you definitely needed something for those muscles. It was a proper lunch though, and it was even better with some fresh greens on the side. Cracklin cornbread is something that pretty much has faded into the background nowadays, but it was the perfect kind of thing for when you had nothing but a skillet, an empty stomach, and a lot of grit and determination to make something worth eating. It's a 10 out of 10 for a lot of Southerners, and nothing's really changing that. Boiled bread dumplings were sometimes known as sinkers, mostly because they would just sit there as if they were sinking into the plate, but these were really as frugal as it would get. This was a dish that was made from old or stale bread, and all it took was fat, some eggs, or just an egg really, and bread, flour, and water. These dumplings were something you would see a lot in immigrant neighborhoods, especially the ones that were always around factories, industrial sites, construction sites, just heavy-duty neighborhoods where most laborers would live to cut down on commute. They started off as a way of just using stale bread so that it wouldn't go to waste. But the question is, how do you actually make dumplings at home like that? Well, the bread was just soaked in hot water, and the flour was mixed in so that it would hold. If an egg wasn't there, it would be a bit looser of a dish, but the dough would still be thickened, and the mixture would just need to be formed into rough balls. The dumplings were then simmered and boiled, and there you had it. Each immigrant community had its own different variation of this too. German, Eastern European, and Czech communities all had their own definition of what making this should be like. Milk toast is also pretty much exactly what you think it is. Back in the old days, it was so much more common for people to take an intentionally frugal approach to how they spent their food, and especially the kind of hacks, snacks, and dishes they would come up with. All of these ideas were centered around being able to make the most using the least amount of time, energy, and ingredients possible. Milk toast is one of the best examples of that because imagine if you tried to make the most out of some milk or some bread before it was about to hit those pearly gates and become fully expired. Yeah? You can't really figure out what to do because while you'd normally just eat them on their own separately, this time that doesn't work. You just go ahead and get milk toast ready. The best part is that it works in 3 different ways. You get a nice healthy meal that's a pretty good breakfast or an interlude meal before your next big meal. You get to save money because you're not letting anything go to waste, nor are you buying something new because these ingredients are probably on their last legs, and you get a pretty lovely dessert out of it too. What's not to like, really? It's kind of insane how convenient milk toast can really be. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them, and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change. But nowadays, even that's like half your rent. Now, if you want to talk about something that's really underrated, it would be criminal to not mention hardtack crackers with honey. These bad boys are about the next best thing when toast just seems like an unlikely fantasy. Also, once 6-0 start pouring that honey on them, they become a completely different meal. Now, hardtacks are always something people have associated with tough times because, being totally real with you, very few people like eating these unless they have to. Everyone would rather prefer some kind of biscuit or actual crackers or just anything to do with cornmeal. But hey, that's what the honey is supposed to be for, and that's honestly what helps it stand out as a perfectly light meal to get your day started. When you're low on money, you can't really pick and choose much, but you can definitely experiment carefully with what you do have. What some people would do is throw them in a skillet and gently fry them with lard for a bit of extra flavor, but that always seemed like it didn't work with the coarse nature of hardtack. What about you? If you had nothing to eat but a tin of these, how are you spicing it up? For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill in the gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them: peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, The dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. So lasagna soup is really as Italian as it gets. It was one of the most common recipes to make when people were coming out of the Depression, because it was extremely comforting and warm. It involved basically the entire blueprint of a lasagna, the pasta, meat, and vegetables, and yes, the unholy amounts of tomato sauce, but it was all in soup form. This dish was something people really treasured both for its taste and how easy it became to prepare it thanks to modern progressions in cooking appliances. You didn't have slow cookers that were half this good back in the 50s and 60s. One of the best reasons to make this dish was that it offered you a lot of nutrition for almost nothing. You could make this using leftovers, random scraps, or even vegetables that are different from what you typically order. This helps keep the soup fresh each time you make it, while also ensuring that it becomes your go-to for a health boost. Who wouldn't want that? Personally, I think the Italians really cracked the code on all this healthy eating stuff. What about you? Would you consider keeping lasagna soup as a side dish in your roster? Or are you a purist who swears there's nothing better than the classic layered, cheesy lasagna? During long military campaigns, soldiers needed food that could withstand the rigors of travel, storage, and time. Salt pork and beans, a combination that became a military staple, particularly during the colonial and Napoleonic Wars. Salt pork was the go-to protein for soldiers because it could be stored for months without refrigeration. The pork was heavily salted to preserve it, a method that also gave it a distinctive, sometimes overpowering flavor. Soldiers learned to love, or at least tolerate, the salty taste, especially when paired with the hearty goodness of beans. Beans, often the dried variety, were another long-lasting and easy-to-prepare food source. When combined with salt pork, they formed a simple, calorie-dense meal that could be boiled up over a campfire. Whether cooked with a little extra fat or simply simmered in water, This dish provided the soldiers with both protein and the energy to endure grueling days on the march. Of course, the meal was hardly a gourmet affair. In fact, some soldiers were less than thrilled by the monotony of it. As any soldier might tell you, when it comes to survival food, variety takes a backseat to reliability. Salt pork and beans delivered just that, reliable sustenance no matter the season or the conditions. As far as names go, this is probably the most insulting one I've ever seen. But nonetheless, a garbage plate is a Rochester classic, and if you're ever in New York, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by not trying it. Yes, you heard me right, a garbage plate. Not following? I wouldn't blame you. If someone told me to eat that, I'd probably think they were making fun of me. In reality, though, a garbage plate is pretty much just this massive behemoth-sized platter that you can really customize and adjust however you would like. Pasta fan? Throw in some macaroni and homemade fries. Meathead? You can't ever have enough ham, sausages, and chicken. Vegetable addict? Works for everyone. Still, who came up with such a massive display of gluttony? Nick Tahu Hots, which used to be one of the top restaurants in New York in 1918, founded by Nick Tahu, apparently made the dish for the first time. It was his way of giving customers the most bang for their buck and giving them a big meal for an affordable price. Quickly, it became a quintessential part of New York's street food culture and a symbol of the kind of indulgence you'd only find in the streets of New York City. The name itself apparently comes from how it looks, which, well, isn't really flattering. Fermented foods were a soldier's unsung hero in the field because of their long shelf life, health benefits, and easy storage. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented grains were common staples, valued for their ability to withstand harsh conditions without spoiling. And when you're out in the middle of nowhere, that's a pretty big deal. The process of fermentation, which involves converting sugars into alcohol or acids, offered a natural boost to the immune system. Fermented foods like sauerkraut are rich in probiotics, which help with digestion and overall gut health. Soldiers, especially during long campaigns, appreciated the natural preservation methods. Without refrigeration, these foods could survive months in storage, often more reliable than any other food they had on hand. While fermented foods may not have been the most exciting part of a soldier's diet, they served a crucial purpose. They were easy to transport, didn't require constant attention, and provided essential nutrients. After a long day in the field, a bite of tangy sauerkraut might have been a welcome change from the usual dried meats or hardtack. Fermented foods were a lifeline in keeping soldiers healthy, and often they gave a taste of home when nothing else could. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Johnny cakes are an incredibly economical meal and also one with extreme amounts of history. They're something that have really deep roots in Native American cooking and also a very long record of being appropriated by settlers, but one way or the other, they managed to spread all over America. Let's cut to the chase. Johnny cakes are actually just fried cornmeal cakes, but they're flat and made on a pan fry. The difference between these and normal pancakes is that these ones actually do not have any kind of eggs, wheat, or leavening to them. And to be honest, that happens a fair amount of times. You may even have enough money to get those things, but you may just not have the energy to do groceries right now. And on days like that, who says you can't indulge in some corny history? You don't even need any kind of tools or ovens for this. All you need is a skillet or an iron griddle. Don't have baking powder? Not a problem. No yeast? Don't even worry about it. Johnny cakes have a massive history of being used in this way by everyone in the country, stretching first from the Narragansett people of Rhode Island to you and I today. That's some history, isn't it? Tallow fried potatoes are the OG French fries. They're insanely flavorful. They have that beautiful golden sheen to them, and they're about as crispy as you would want the perfect batch of French fries to be. A lot of that color, vividness, and flavor comes from the fact that they're fried in rendered beef fat instead of vegetable oil. Now, back in the day, and I mean way before the 80s, fast food joints like McDonald's were actually using beef tallow in their fries as well. That was a big part of what gave them that original iconic flavor. Tallow helps potatoes achieve a savory flavor that they would never be able to get to on their own. Plus, this just isn't there today with the modern oils we have. The best part really was the exterior, because a simple first bite was about as close to nirvana as you could get. If you were eating these when you were borderline starving, then you were pretty much about to have the best food experience of your life. Tallow was the go-to frying fat for a lot of American diners and fast food kitchens, and it's just not hard to see why. And then, you ever have leftovers but you don't want to make what you had last night? If your leftovers happen to be potatoes, mashed or otherwise, then potato cakes are your hero for today's Saturday dinner. Potato cakes are the ultimate leftover glow-up, and they're a fine example of how putting a little bit of faith, time, and creativity into what you think is nothing that's special can actually result in a killer dish. Hot cornbread is a historically significant variation of cornbread. Why? It's because it was so common in many disadvantaged communities in the South. Poor Black communities and even white communities in towns and rural outskirts from the 19th to the 20th century would try to get through the week just by lasting on this. As far as keeping it low-key is concerned, this minimalistic dish is definitely the way to go, and cornmeal, boiling water, and salt is all you need. It doesn't need eggs, milk, or wheat flour, it doesn't need any kind of oven, and it also doesn't really feel like a meal either. A small scoop of cornmeal was enough to make a lot of patties, yeah, but you needed a decent amount of sides to make sure it was actually a fulfilling dish, like beans, greens, and potatoes would help a lot. Also, in Black Southern communities, hot water cornbread was one of their core recipes, a real pillar of the community, and each different variation of cornbread was passed down from generation to generation, usually just by observation, word of mouth, or having someone drill the lesson into your head. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Boiled wheat berries and sugar syrup porridge is something that's the kind of breakfast that just transports you through time. It takes you back to a world where everything is made from scratch. There's no back of the label you have to read, and the phrase pre-packaged isn't something your kids know yet. Nothing went to waste, everything was fresh, it was what Cartoon Network made you think the world was going to be like. Or those Disney and Ghibli movies. Just anything with a hint of soul, you know? The wheat berries were really exquisite too. The ideal thing for putting somebody in a food coma. Flavor-wise, this is as rustic and comforting as it gets. The wheat berries have a very nutty aroma to them, an incredibly chewy texture, and the syrup is something that gives a very nice sweetness. It makes the dish feel like a wonderful treat without really doing too much, and the syrup is something that really adds to that. It's one of those breakfasts that really makes a cold morning into a scene ripped right out of some indie film. The porridge was something that peaked in popularity throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and that was especially true for rural households where wheat was very cheap and accessible. Today, it's a nostalgic recipe you find in ancient cookbooks, but it's worth making. In the chaos of ancient and medieval warfare, time was a luxury, and so was leavened bread. When soldiers needed sustenance on the go, they turned to flatbread, a simple yet effective solution. Made from flour and water, sometimes with a pinch of salt, it required no rising time and could be baked on a flat stone or a metal plate over an open fire. Flatbread was a culinary bridge between cultures. From the Roman legions to medieval Arab armies, its versatility made it a universal staple. Soldiers could eat it plain, use it to scoop up stew, or even wrap it around dried meat for an early version of the sandwich. And unlike leavened bread, flatbread was far more forgiving. It could survive days of travel without becoming a crumbly mess. It wasn't all perfection, though. Cooking over a fire meant the bread could be scorched in seconds if you weren't careful. More than a few soldiers probably had to settle for extra crispy flatbread when they got distracted by a battle horn. Still, this simple, adaptable bread earned its reputation as a battlefield favorite. So, a sliced onion and mayonnaise sandwich was actually a proper friend to people back then. This meal still felt like pre-crisis times in the 20th century, when you could come home expecting a sandwich every day. Onions were again preferred so heavily because of how easy they were to grow, how cheap they were to buy, how well they survived in most climates, and the immense amount of variety that they had. A few slices of onions, caramelized, with beautiful mayonnaise was literally heaven to people back then. It's also just like diet-friendly food now. This is something that really takes no money, effort, time, or resources. Well, besides 2 slices of bread and some onions to make, and gives you a filling sandwich in return, which is more than most can say for a lot of meals that came from the toughest times in the 20th century. It was definitely peasant food, but it was still something that tasted good, which was really all somebody wants when they're in a bad spot. Gooey butter cake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for 2 reasons. Gooey butter cake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis gooey butter cake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop. growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool, showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Applesauce bread is essentially what you think it is. This super cozy, sweet-smelling loaf of bread works wonders, and it makes your entire kitchen feel like an advertisement for autumn, but right in the middle of April. It's soft, really moist, and spiced just right so that it's not really overwhelming, but you can definitely pick up on those cinnamon and nutmeg notes. A bit of clove here and there also does wonders for the dish. The applesauce is something that keeps it really tender without needing a lot of butter or soil, and this is, to be honest, most of the point. It was a go-to during the 30s and 40s, especially in wartime kitchens where fat and eggs were pretty much rationed. Applesauce was really cheap. It was something that was easy to get at home, it doubled as a sweetener in a binder, and it ended up being perfect for cakes, breads, and cookies. Flavor-wise, it's something that you could call a mixture of banana bread and spice cake, so it's not too sugary, but it feels rich enough that you can definitely call it a dessert. Just the way corned beef hash was revolutionary because it made beef so available, canned tomato sauce was the same. Macaroni and tomatoes is an example of how people received the introduction of canned food with a lot of excitement. I mean, if you were told that you didn't have to spend half an hour in the kitchen beating up sticky tomatoes to make a paste, and you could just go buy one for a few cents, wouldn't you be happy? Plus, it was an excuse to get out of the house. At least we have grocery store escapes in common. We also have macaroni and tomatoes in common. mostly because just like bacon ends and boiled greens, this is a dish that would hold up perfectly in today's culinary climate. Boiled elbow macaroni would be mixed with canned or fresh tomatoes or tomato paste, finished with just a bit of grease, lard, or butter, and then seasoned with salt and pepper. While the flavor of the dish was mostly the same, what was really interesting was the way its texture could change so wildly. This could be made like a stew, thick and velvety, or it could be made like a soup, creamy and slightly thin, but overall thick. People definitely took advantage of that and changed it up as much as they could to keep things fresh. Dandelion and bacon grease salad is an example of how Depression-era and 20th century foraging can actually lead to some really innovative recipes. This is something that's rooted in rural Midwestern culture, and this salad makes use of whatever is available in the wilds that day. One of the most common things you would ever find in these wilds was dandelion greens. They grew wild in all kinds of environments, roadsides, fields, and yards, and they were a really prized thing for the people. Most folks believed it was a natural remedy for a lot of things because it was believed to help with things like indigestion, inflammation, and strengthening your immune system. In subsistence farming areas and coal country, it was very common for families to teach their kids how to forage dandelion greens. Remember how I told you about the way bacon grease is used in a lot of these dishes? Yeah, so after frying the bacon, a small amount of bacon grease would be preserved and it would be used to flavor any kind of bland or plain dish like beans and cornbread and give it a bit of a savory edge. The rendered fat was really helpful to people because it also meant they didn't exactly need that much oil. Fried cornbread batter is what it sounds like, to be honest. It's a cornbread mix that involves no eggs or sugar, and it's spooned right into a hot skillet and fried like a pancake. And some people actually prefer the term corn dodgers because of this. Although, my personal favorite is hoe cakes. It depends on the region, and it's the same idea, the hot and crispy golden discs of fried corn. Goodness you get are indescribably amazing and rich. Plus, inside they're really soft and crumbly, while on the outside, they have those perfectly browned edges that you just want with every single bite. This was minimalist Southern food. Well, as minimal as anything can ever be in the South. It didn't originate in typical Southern communities, though. This was a dish that came right out of African American traditions, and it was passed down through several generations because of how effective it was at keeping you full. These days, you don't really see fried cornbread batter anywhere except barbecue joints that try to pay respect to their vintage roots. But with a dish this easy, bringing it back wouldn't take any work at all. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. Life on the march wasn't glamorous, and neither was the food, but it was dependable. Pottage was the workhorse of pre-modern diets, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever grains, legumes, and vegetables were on hand. Think of it as the ultimate clean-out-the-pantry recipe, centuries before that was trendy. It was survival in a pot. Soldiers would boil ingredients together, letting them simmer for hours over a fire. Barley, peas, lentils, onions, whatever was in season or could last on the road made it in. And if you were lucky enough to have access to bread, it became the perfect accompaniment to soak up every last drop. Pottage was endlessly customizable. In lean times, it might be just barley and water. During rare moments of abundance, soldiers might toss in some herbs, bones, or even a bit of meat, transforming it into a feast. Medieval armies didn't have Michelin stars, but they did know how to stretch a meal. Of course, it wasn't always exciting. It was the same flavor, day after day. Still, when you're cold, hungry, and far from home, a bowl of pottage could taste better than gold. After all, the real luxury was staying alive and staying warm. For centuries, armies on the move relied on foods that were as tough as the soldiers themselves. Dried beans and lentils were real tiny powerhouses of nutrition that were easy to carry, nearly impossible to spoil, and packed with protein and calories. With a little water and patience, these humble legumes could transform into a hearty meal capable of sustaining entire armies. They were very economical. A single sack of lentils could feed dozens, making them a staple in ancient armies like the Romans and the Greeks. Lentils were so integral to the Roman diet that some historians called them the soldier's caviar, though that might have been more wishful thinking than reality. Cooking them, however, wasn't always straightforward. Soldiers often had to soak them overnight, a luxury they didn't always have during marches or battles. This meant the occasional crunchy surprise when time ran out. Despite their simplicity, beans and lentils had one undeniable perk. They could adapt to almost any flavor. Whether cooked in a broth with onions and herbs or simply boiled with a pinch of salt, they delivered the nourishment soldiers needed to keep fighting. And while no one was writing poetry about legumes, one thing was certain: these little guys pulled their weight. Hot water fried cornmeal cakes are an old-school Southern staple that don't really get even half the love and attention they should these days. I just want you to visualize a crispy, golden brown cornmeal cake with the most incandescent exterior you've ever seen, and then a tender, soft center that just leaves you wanting more and more. But it's natural, and even good, to get curious. And when you hear hot water fried anything, your first instinct is to immediately go like, wait, what? And I really wouldn't blame you. The practice of making cornmeal cakes this way is something that actually goes back several centuries, right back to the enslaved African Americans in the South who were making the first versions of these. Without access to proper feed, not even leavening, they found a way to make do with just cornmeal and water, and these were also known by a much more popular name, hoe cakes. Now, in the end, they started to fall out of everyone's go-to cooking preferences, but I think cornmeal cakes have one more comeback in them, despite it all. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Egg and tomato gravy over rice is still something that you can consider a proper meal, though. So, the thing about the 20th century is that people back then had a way stronger knack for gardening and farming than we ever did or maybe will. It actually helped an intense amount during times like the Depression, because it would mean you could do super simple things like this. Who needs meat, breadcrumbs, oil, and cheese when you can just boil some rice, scramble some eggs, beat some tomatoes to hell and back, get a sick paste, and have a meal? It's easy work. It doesn't take anything, and it's convenient and nearly free if you're growing your own stuff. Today, it would make for a pretty decent meal in between your dinner and breakfast, too. If you're looking for something that's refreshing, full of energy, protein, and still on the healthy side of things, then this is definitely a dish you should keep in mind. It's something that we got from the South, but it's also something you would see in cities sometimes. The idea of making gravy out of it also helped people a lot in broadening their horizons to more curry gravy-based rice dishes, which are essential for surviving through times when food is a resource and not entertainment. When sugar was too expensive and food had to stretch, people turned to what was available. Molasses milk was a simple but effective way to add some much-needed energy to the day. Molasses was a pantry staple in many homes, especially in the South, where sugarcane processing made it cheap and accessible. It lasted longer than sugar, had essential minerals like iron and calcium, and most importantly, it was affordable. Families would stir a spoonful into a glass of milk, creating a slightly sweet, slightly bitter drink that packed more nutrients than plain milk alone. Some even believed it had health benefits, making it an early version of a fortified drink. This wasn't just a product of the Depression. It had been around for generations. In farming communities, molasses was often used as a sweetener when refined sugar was too costly. Children drank it before heading to school, and laborers relied on it for an energy boost before a long day of work. For those who grew up with it, molasses milk was a taste of childhood, a reminder of tough but resourceful times. It wasn't fancy, but it was proof that sometimes all you needed was a little sweetness to get through the day. When flour was a luxury and wheat was scarce, people turned to what they had: cornmeal. That's how corn dodgers became a staple in struggling households across rural America. Corn had long been the backbone of Southern and frontier cooking, but during the Great Depression, it became even more essential. Cornmeal was cheap, widely available, and didn't require the refrigeration that more expensive ingredients did. Mixing it with water, salt, and sometimes a bit of fat or milk, families shaped the batter into small cakes and either fried them in a pan or baked them on a hot stone. The result? A crispy, golden bite of sustenance that could be eaten plain, dipped in water, or, on good days, smothered in gravy. The ingenuity behind corn dodgers lay in their versatility. They could replace bread, be carried on long journeys without spoiling, and even serve as a side dish to stretch a meager meal. Cowboys and pioneers ate them, and so did struggling families in the 1930s. For many, the taste of corn dodgers is a reminder of resilience, a symbol of making do when options were limited. A handful of cornmeal, a little heat, and a lot of determination were all it took. Rice and raisins were a really humble dish. When I talk about the psychological factor when it comes to eating, I'm referring to dishes like this. Rice on its own is perfectly edible, and it's something that people have eaten plain with nothing else for centuries. But eventually, that got old, didn't it? And even in the toughest of times, people needed a good snack, a sweet treat, something for the soul, a lot like how we do now. Their way of doing this on a budget? Take advantage of what Mother Nature's growing for you and throw in some raisins, which were really lovely because they were something that was abundant. You could either forage it, you could buy small boxes in bulk, and these were still relatively affordable, or government commodity drives and distributions would drop a few in your basket. The simplest iteration of this dish is just rice and raisins boiled in water, salt, and a pot. But if you want to take it a bit further, you can also mix in some milk, sugar, and butter, and elevate this dish into something that's a lot closer to a kind of rice-based custard or pudding. Kind of like kheer, from Southeast Asian cultures if you've ever had it. Rice and raisins were a really humble dish. When I talk about the psychological factor when it comes to eating, I'm referring to dishes like this. Rice on its own is perfectly edible, and it's something that people have eaten plain with nothing else for centuries. But eventually, that got old, didn't it? And even in the toughest of times, people needed a good snack, a sweet treat, something for the soul, a lot like how we do now. Their way of doing this on a budget? Take advantage of what Mother Nature's growing for you and throw in some raisins, which were really lovely because they were something that was abundant. You could either forage it, you could buy small boxes in bulk, and these were still relatively affordable, or government commodity drives and distributions would drop a few in your basket. The simplest iteration of this dish is just rice and raisins boiled in water, salt, and a pot. But if you want to take it a bit further, you can also mix in some milk, sugar, and butter, and elevate this dish into something that's a lot closer to a kind of rice-based custard or pudding. Kind of like kheer, from Southeast Asian cultures if you've ever had it. When protein was hard to come by, people got creative with what they had. Peanut butter soup was a Depression-era meal that turned a pantry staple into a warm, filling dish that kept hunger at bay. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein, and didn't spoil easily, making it a lifesaver for struggling families. Instead of spreading it thin on bread, some turned it into soup. The method was simple. Peanut butter was mixed with water or milk and heated until it became a creamy, slightly nutty broth. Some added sugar for a sweeter version, while others used salt and onions to create something more savory. This dish wasn't just a product of tough times. Variations of peanut-based soups existed long before the Great Depression, especially in African and Asian cuisines. But in America, it became a way to stretch a single jar of peanut butter further than sandwiches ever could. It may not have been a culinary masterpiece, but peanut butter soup did what it needed to: provide warmth, nutrition, and just enough comfort to make a tough day a little easier. For those who ate it, the memory stuck. Not for its taste, but for what it represented, making do with whatever was on hand and turning the simplest ingredients into survival. Cabbage and potato hash. Honestly, it doesn't get more economical than this either, so it's a fantastic place to start. Let me tell you a little something about cabbages and potatoes before we begin dissecting this dish. So, back in the days before modern refrigeration became such a nationally accepted miracle, people actually used to worry a lot about the seasonal nature of ingredients, fruits, and vegetables. Cabbage and potatoes were arguably the sole exception to this because they can be grown and cooked pretty much throughout the entire season. Now, this was also a dish that took barely any oil or lard, and also didn't really require any kind of cooking utensils, skills, or experience. It's one of the most ideal dinners because potatoes and cabbage are always available for dirt cheap in markets, and you can make an infinite amount of combinations through them. Though some people really don't like their cabbage, something about the texture. Which side of the boat do you find yourself leaning towards? Are cabbage and potato hash something you'd try if your wallet was in bad enough shape? Or would you have a taste anyway just to see? When flour was a luxury and wheat was scarce, people turned to what they had: cornmeal. That's how corn dodgers became a staple in struggling households across rural America. Corn had long been the backbone of Southern and frontier cooking, but during the Great Depression, it became even more essential. Cornmeal was cheap, widely available, and didn't require the refrigeration that more expensive ingredients did. Mixing it with water, salt, and sometimes a bit of fat or milk, families shaped the batter into small cakes and either fried them in a pan or baked them on a hot stone. The result? A crispy, golden bite of sustenance that could be eaten plain, dipped in water, or, on good days, smothered in gravy. The ingenuity behind corn dodgers lay in their versatility. They could replace bread, be carried on long journeys without spoiling, and even serve as a side dish to stretch a meager meal. Cowboys and pioneers ate them, and so did struggling families in the 1930s. For many, the taste of corn dodgers is a reminder of resilience, a symbol of making do when options were limited. A handful of cornmeal, a little heat, and a lot of determination were all it took. Corn dodgers weren't always the Super Bowl phenomena you know them to be today. Back in the day, they were actually one of the few ways where families could eat and still be full. Corn dodgers basically involve corn cakes that are either fried or baked and then served as a main dish. But when people had any kind of meat or potatoes, just anything at all that was bulkier and heavier to serve it with, they would almost always serve it as a side dish. Still, corn dodgers were essential to getting by the day back then, and they're just as important now. Making these at home is as easy as it gets as well, because once you have the mixture for a corn cake ready, which is a really simple process involving like 3 steps max, all you need to do is shape them into form and get to frying. These make for such a cheap and affordable midday snack, and they're the perfect thing to come back to from work. Best part? You can prepare meals and make enough corn cake batter and just freeze it, so you don't even have to deal with the entire process when you get back home tired from work. When apples were too expensive and food couldn't go to waste, people got creative. That's how green tomato pie found its way onto the dinner table, an unexpected dessert made from the last scraps of the garden. Unripe tomatoes, too tough and tart to eat raw, were sliced thin and cooked down with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of vinegar to mimic the tang of apples. Once baked into a pie crust, the transformation was almost magical. The texture softened, the flavors melded, and if you didn't know better, you might not have realized you weren't eating apples at all. This dish had deep roots in frugality, especially in farming communities. When the first frost threatened to ruin unripened tomatoes, families picked them early rather than letting them go to waste. In an era where every ingredient mattered, throwing food away wasn't an option. For those who grew up on it, green tomato pie was more than just a dessert. It was a reminder of making the best of what you had. It was about ingenuity in the kitchen, where necessity was often the only option. Even in hard times, a little sugar and a lot of creativity could turn the unexpected into something sweet. Johnny cakes with sorghum syrup are just straight-up comfort food from a time when breakfast was this familial thing everybody looked forward to, and when breakfast was entirely made from scratch. Johnny cakes are these rustic little cornmeal pancakes that are actually very no-nonsense. None of the fluff, flair, and aesthetic charm you would normally associate with pancakes. Do you know that super cozy vibe they give off? Just not there this time. Johnny cakes are coarse, they're not the eBay when it comes to presentation, and they actually have this very deep, toasty corn flavor that pairs almost a little too well with the smokiness and richness of sorghum syrup. You can either use this in a dipping cup or drizzle it on top, but let's be real, the dipping cup is sacred. Anything else is blasphemy. Johnny cakes also have something of a history that goes back all the way to the indigenous peoples. They were the first ones to teach colonists how you handle cornmeal and how you should cook with it, and they were made to mirror the effects of other popular survivalist Native American food, such as pemmican. Its main function was lasting on long journeys and providing you with a boost of energy to carry on with your travels. That wraps up 2 hours of the meals that helped our grandparents survive the toughest times. Which one surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.